People who are trying to use Scrum well are using it for nothing more than processing a to-do list. And that is not the point. It's never been the point. This is actually intended to be a tool for you and your company to become agile, more profitable, better in the market. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So there's some business discussions you can have with stakeholders in your company about Scrum. Then we're going to look briefly, although most of the people in here are well versed in Scrum, I'll make that very, very brief. We'll walk through what Scrum is, just in case there are any folks who haven't experienced that, really quickly. And finally, the Visual Studio 2.0 Scrum process template from Microsoft, how that looks in TFS. And then we'll just sort of walk through a scenario of how we might use that in real life, how a development team and a Scrum team might work with Team Foundation Server. This is one of the things that I like to show to executives, because just about everything on here is going to feel personal to someone, which is kind of funny. Regardless of how healthy your organization is, something like this is probably going on, and that being the case, Scrum is a tool that you can use to combat these problems and try and take back control of these sorts of issues in your organization. What we get from iterative incremental processes like Scrum is a very different way of looking at work than we used to. So in some regard, this is an old story, because for the past 15 years or so, we've been talking about agility so much and so well that most people are building software this way now. We all understand that that red line up there of a plan-driven project is just a bad idea. Most organizations aren't doing this. And here are some of the reasons. When you are in a plan-driven development type of project or organization, you have a big party at the beginning. Everybody looks at the charter for the project, right? Big kickoff. If you're Microsoft, you hire the Rolling Stones to come play in the cafeteria, whatever. And then everybody goes away for a year. And right about 3/4 of the way through here, some sales guy says, "Give me what you got and I can sell it." And they say, "Well, sorry, we can't have it because we're still working on the data layer." A little different with iterative incremental practices like Scrum. We inspect the product publicly very often. That is the heart and soul of Agile in the first place, particularly Scrum. If you want to characterize it for your executives as you discuss it, the key is this: we ship software around here, often. That's what it comes down to. We make some initial architectural decisions probably when we are jumping into a project, and those will lock us into a course of action, .NET, Java, et cetera, and of course our ability to change our minds about those things will go down over time. With agility, with iterative incremental practices like these, we find that our ability to change goes down at a much slower rate. That's architecture and business practices. We can hit those things that are the highest risk items first, and as such, lower our risk quicker in a given project. So we can, instead of waiting until the end and doing one big bang release and, oh my gosh, I hope it works, we release a little bit all the time, and that makes our risk go down significantly. And finally, because we're doing that, we can ship those items that are of highest value first. This is the product owner's responsibility. Primarily, this is what product owners do. They make the decision about what's next, in effect. What is next in order that we are going to ship? And that better be the right decision. It's a very hard job. This book is new in the market. It's a book by Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. I believe it's on Amazon now and all that good stuff. It's been out for about 6 weeks, not very long. I've been reading this on a Word document for quite a while, so you can get it in print now. This is a book that is specifically meant for you to have a conversation with your managers or your leaders or your executives in your company. The number one thing that we hear from companies developers in particular, IT folks who want to try some of this agility stuff, is how do I talk to my manager about it? How do I convince these people this is a good idea? What this book says is going to help and also help you and also call you to account. What it effectively says is you need frequent rapid delivery of software in order to run your business well. And oh, by the way, if your software developers can't give you software in 30 days or less, find some new software developers, because that's what professionalism means. Okie doke. So let's look really quickly at what Scrum is. It's pretty small, fits in a box, or fits in a PDF, about 17 pages long. This is a document at scrum.org called the Scrum Guide. It is not a methodology, but a framework, which is a fine point difference for a lot of people. But the bottom line is that Scrum will not solve all your problems for you. That's going to be up to you. And the rules of engagement are in this document. The rules of Scrum, not the strategies for how to play the game. Okay, so this is like if you go and buy a Monopoly game at the toy store for your children, you turn and look at the lid. Inside that lid are just the rules. There are no strategies on how to win and be effective with those rules. That's exactly the same for this Scrum Guide. Scrum Guide changes occasionally. We're going to see the effect of that on Team Foundation Server, which is quite interesting. The last version of the Scrum Guide came out in October of 2011. We will probably see a new version of the Scrum Guide by the end of this month. I'm sorry, not June, July, by the end of July. If not, then certainly within August. And little changes, little things that we try and make sure that Scrum itself and those rules continue to adapt and serve the needs of modern software development teams. For example, there is a difference. Right now, if you read the Scrum Guide, it says when you go into sprint planning, you got two phases. Want to figure out what we're going to make, and then we're going to figure out how we're going to make it. You know what? That's up to you. Come on. So we'll just define instead in a future version. Here are the inputs to the Scrum Guide or to the sprint planning meeting, which include the product backlog itself, feedback on the old increment, the commitments the team has made from the last retrospective. And then we want to know what the output is. The output, quite frankly, is a sprint backlog. That's the output with a goal, with a sprint goal. So how you get there inside that room is up to you. And that is the strategy for how you play the game. And we're trying really hard to pull those things out of Scrum so that the best way for your organization to work can be up to you. Scrum has these elements. We're going to talk really quickly through them. Product owner, development team, Scrum master. Every methodology or framework like this for processing work you will find has roles, artifacts, and events. It's kind of how these things work. In Scrum, those are our roles. Our artifacts, there are only 3. They're very simple. We've got the increment itself. This is the software that we make and hopefully are shipping, or at least able to show and release at the end of each sprint. Also, we have a product backlog. I think about this as the big pile of desirements, because probably these things are not written as failing tests. They're written in a Word document or in a TFS work item type or something else that I can't compile. And if I can't compile it, I just hope it someday works. If, however, I can compile it as a test, you can prove to me later that it works by making that test pass. So I think about product backlog items as desirements unless I can hit Control-Shift-B on them. Sprint backlog is a very short plan for what the development team will do in a sprint. And these events, of course, are the heart and soul of Scrum. Each of these is a time-boxed event, that is to say, has a maximum, not a minimum duration. So we have a little model here where we'll walk through this. The whole intent is to take a product backlog and turn that into an increment over a period of time that we call a sprint. The product owner is the person responsible for optimizing the value of that product backlog, ensuring that the highest value items are ordered near the top. And we have a development team that the product owner needs to collaborate with fairly frequently in order to get the things created that they need to release. Now, the product owner and the development team work together in this meeting, the sprint planning meeting. This is how we kick off a sprint. Often it's facilitated by a Scrum Master, but the intent is to come out of that with a sprint backlog. This is the plan for what the development team will do over the course of the sprint. Now, this is a key component of discussion when we look at how Team Foundation Server works. The sprint backlog, and I want to be really careful when I say this, the sprint backlog is owned by, created by, for, and only really necessarily visible to the development team. The sprint backlog is for the development team. I'll say it one more time because TFS puts it on the front of everything in this system. The sprint backlog is not for your manager. It is not for your boss. It is not for the Scrum Master, really, and it's not for the product owner. It is for the development team. It is their plan for how they are going to solve this particular increment of software. If that's not what's going on in your organization, you are typical. One of the things that development teams do in Scrum is this daily Scrum meeting, which probably characterizes Scrum more than any other single thing. When people think about developers standing in a circle looking at a wall, they typically think about Scrum. And that's too bad, because what we tend to find is that everybody thinks the intent of a daily Scrum is to do this. What'd you do since this time yesterday? What are you going to do today? You know, that sort of discussion, these three questions. The intent of the daily Scrum is to create a plan for the next 24 hours. For the development team to create a plan for itself for the next day to reach the sprint goal. That's the intent of the daily Scrum. 15-minute time box event. If that's not happening, you're not alone. Sprint review, this is an opportunity to inspect and adapt the product increment that's been delivered in the sprint. Anybody who wants to can come to this. We show the product that we just made, the increment that is done in this particular sprint, and we get feedback. This is key. In this discussion, we get feedback from the stakeholders, and hopefully the product owner is asking questions about the product increment, like, what do you think? And then recording the answers to that question inside the product backlog. If that doesn't happen, if what happens for you is that you show up at a sprint review meeting and you get to watch 30 minutes of PowerPoint followed by a quick don't ask me any questions demo, you are not alone. The sprint retrospective is an opportunity to inspect and adapt the team and its practices itself. So the sprint retrospective is an opportunity for the team to sit down and say, in effect, how are we doing? And how would we like to improve? The output of that sprint retrospective should be a plan to actually improve. That is to say, an actionable commitment or two from the Scrum team for what they will do in the next sprint. If you do not have an actionable outcome from the sprint retrospective, why are you having it? And you're not alone. We take the output of that sprint retrospective, those actionable commitments like, hey, next sprint, we are going to automate the build. And we use that in the sprint planning meeting next time. Because it turns out that when we commit to each other that we're going to automate the build, that has an impact on how much work we can pull in the next sprint planning meeting. Okay, let's hop over here to talk about Visual Studio and what Microsoft has done in support of Scrum inside Visual Studio Team Foundation Server. There are a couple of guys at Microsoft named Aaron Bjork and Greg Bohr who think a lot about this all day long. This is what they do. They sit there and think about process templates for Team Foundation Server. Wouldn't you love that? Well, the good news is that I know these guys, and they're really nice guys, and they're bribable. And what that means is that the nomenclature, the taxonomy, the vocabulary, the language of this Visual Studio process template is pretty darn accurate according to the Scrum Guide. In other words, the Scrum Guide, that set of rules that we talked about earlier, this Visual Studio process template is sort of a model of that Scrum Guide. Now, here's the thing. I'll show you in a couple of instances there has been a little bit of of lag and overlap. So we release a Scrum guide, they release a TFS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little bit of that going on. Not much, but we'll look at it. There are some reports that are manifested inside TFS that are really good and handy things to have. I tried to build up a big data warehouse for us, and that's just oppressive. So let's look instead at, real quickly, just some screenshots of this, and then we'll jump into the tool and just stay playing inside that tool. Okay, so this is a sprint burn down, and one of the things that was made, one of the recent changes to Scrum is this. There are no requirements for burn down charts in Scrum. Period. End of story. Sprint plan needs to be summed in terms of remaining work on a daily basis. So every day we expect the development team to sum work remaining. A visualization of that Scrum teams have been doing for the past 10 years looks like this. It's called a burn down chart. Works great. It is not the only way to monitor your progress in a sprint. It is how teams using Team Foundation Server monitor their progress in a sprint typically. And it's fine. Absolutely fine. This is how 99% of the world does it. We're on the verge of a change. And the reason we changed the Scrum Guide is because here's what I want to see as a sprint plan at some point in my life. A big pile of failing tests. And the job then becomes, and we monitor our progress by making those tests pass. How many tests are still not passing? And that's the remaining work of the sprint. I think we can get there from here. We're a ways away. So this is currently how most teams think about monitoring progress throughout the sprint. Burn downs are in there, great. Also, we have velocity reports. Velocity is a measure, a historical measure of how much or how many product backlog items a team has in effect delivered in a sprint. This works just fine. This is a release burn down. It basically shows how much work remains toward a particular release. However, how does this play in the world of continuous delivery? Continuous delivery is a model wherein we might be releasing every couple of hours, days, whatever the case may be. Scrum absolutely supports this. In light of that October 2011 Scrum Guide removes the release burn down or release planning, that activity of release planning, removes it from Scrum itself. Can you keep doing this? Absolutely. If you are in a business that ships software on a release schedule, you probably need to be doing release planning. But not everybody does that, and that's just fine too. So this is a report that is inside Team Foundation Server. Here are some work item types that are also in TFS that support Scrum directly. I want to just quickly hit a couple of these. The product backlog item, not much change since 2010. We'll look at it. Task. Remember that we said a sprint backlog is that plan for how we're going to deliver the increment. The way we do that in TFS and the way most people create a plan is with tasks. And so we have work items to support that. Not always necessary, but that is what we're doing here in TFS. Now these code review and feedback request work item types, if you haven't seen these this week, you'll probably see them in another session. This is to support a tool that allows for code review and for application feedback, people to go check out the increment while it's in progress. So that's a very different tool, not really relevant here, so I'm just going to walk past it. Then there's the impediment work item type. That has a Scrum sound to it. And then test case and shared steps, those are for Microsoft Test Manager, not really a Scrum thing, they just happen to be in there. And then finally, we've gotten rid of the sprint work item type. Getting rid of that sprint work item type was a coup. And the reason is because what we used to have to do is create a sprint work item type for each sprint and then set the begin date and end date on that work item. It was just a pain to manage. And they did that specifically so there would be something to key on to generate the reports that we needed to see in SQL Server reporting services. Okay, I'm going to jump over here into my virtual machine, and I assume everybody has seen Visual Studio by now, Visual Studio 2012, because I didn't hear anybody go, what the, stop. So that's our new development environment. Yeah. Okay, here we have some product backlog items in here, and most of them are, well, as I say, they are product backlog items, so that's the product backlog item work, item type. There we go. So, a couple of things about this that are interesting to me, and I hope to you. This bit. As a user, I want so that. We all know what stories are by now, right? Here's what I want you to please, please, please remember this and take it home. User stories have nothing to do with Scrum. Guess what also makes a perfectly valid product backlog item? A picture, or a use case, or whatever you would like to use. So user stories are fine. I happen to be using a virtual machine right now, as you know. If you go out to the cloud service right now, which I don't dare do, and not because of the cloud service, but because the facility has had some connectivity issues today. If you go out there and you create a new product backlog item in that environment, it will not have the as a I want so that template in there. That's specifically at scrum.org's request, and Greg and Aaron were really good about that. So when you open up and do a new work item, it's going to look like this. Describe it however you want. If you want to use a user story, awesome. If you don't, don't. Okay? Acceptance criteria is where we record what we want to, or how we know we're done, in effect, with this particular item. We've got these fields of effort and business value, and we'll come back to those in just a moment. And for now, I'm going to pop over to the web access. This is Team Foundation Web Access, or Team Web Access. I don't know exactly what the whole term is now, frankly. But this is the dashboard, really, where all the tools are pushing us now. So if you're inside that Team Explorer that looks a bit odd, this guy, and you click on something, it has a very high likelihood of pushing you over to that web access dashboard. Now, inside this web access dashboard is where we're going to do most of our planning, most of our preparation, and then for a sprint, and then most of the work tracking during the sprint. I don't have an awesome burn down going here. I need to quit saying awesome. You guys have told me that. All these European guys say that, all us Americans say awesome, super, and stuff like that. So I'm trying really hard to cut it out, but it's just in there. Okay. The burn down that we're looking at here obviously doesn't look like what we would hope a burn down chart looks like. This is because there's just some funky data in there. What's interesting about this particular burn down chart is that it is coming off the operational store of data. It is not coming out of the data warehouse. That's nice, because that means we don't have to wait for a data refresh. We don't have to rebuild that data warehouse before this report gens. Okay? So that's a good thing. So from here, we can create a new product backlog item if that happens to be what I want to do. I can create a new task. Now, this is an interesting thing, because what it says is that I can create a task that does not have a child, that does not have a parent that is a product backlog item. That creates some data relationship funkiness, but okay, I get it. This happens occasionally. It's going to, Scrum doesn't care. Let's be real clear about this. If you want to do that, knock yourself out. That's what work looks like in your head, no problem. Team Foundation Server will not care for it in some cases. It won't, for example, or have that rolled up into your velocity report. Right? Because the velocity report is coming off of the estimated effort of the product backlog items, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So we've got a bug work item type. Now, this one's funny. So a bug work item type, you may note here, has an effort. And often organizations use planning poker or some sort of relative estimation technique. Let's pretend planning poker. We're going to create a bug here. Some bug. And that happens to be the same way most teams estimate product backlog items. And so it's a pretty common conversation. Is a bug a product backlog item? Is a product backlog, is that a legitimate PBI? Is it a task? How do you deal with this? Well, Scrum doesn't care. Scrum actually looks at this as a product backlog item, period. And I had a really good conversation with Darren and Greg in which I could not bribe them to not put a bug work item type into this process template. Now, the reason for that is because when your automated build fails, guess what happens? It creates a bug work item type inside TFS. Awesome. There, I did it. Okay, so we have a bug work item type. If you guys want to use bugs, whatever, they make perfectly legitimate product backlog items. No worries. The PBI state model is an interesting thing. I'm going to open this guy up. Let's go ahead and create a new product backlog item. So some feature that I want, and we might come in and estimate it or not, but let's say for now we're just going to save this thing as new. I'm not even going to put in an interesting description. We'll just do a save. Now when I do a save, this work item, this product backlog item, gets saved as new. This is a workflow state. It's not so much a workflow engine, it's really a state transition engine, but that said, it's this piece of metadata that says this thing is in a new state. Now the next thing that I might do with this product backlog item is approve it. What does that mean? I have no idea. I do not know how Scrum teams are going to use this. I can think of a few different ways that you might use this, but I've got this interim state in here that you're going to have to deal with in your planning process. It might mean that the team the development team and the product owner are sat down, they've done some backlog grooming, and that they all agree this is actionable. Maybe that's what it means. It's a piece of metadata. So don't get too hung up on it. If we approve this thing, let's just pretend that what that means is everybody understands what it what it would take to implement. And I suppose then we've also estimated it. Probably shouldn't be able to approve it unless it's estimated. The next state that we can go into is a committed state. This committed state is something that I would have given my left little toe if they would have gotten rid of. And here's why. How many of you, because almost everyone raised their hand when I asked them who's using Scrum. How many people in here who are using Scrum talk about that sprint backlog that we create in the sprint planning meeting as a commitment? Your team has committed to delivering this. Let me see some hands. How many? Okay, so that's quite a few. That's not uncommon. The thing about that is that we're committing to scope. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but it's a very difficult thing to actually assert that we're committing to scope. Okay, so we've got our standard reports in SSRS. We've got the dashboard here. Let's go over to check out our backlog. We can go view our product backlog. This is a set of work items or product backlog items that we might want to manage, and maybe I, as a product owner, have been entering a few product backlog items. I can create one here, a new PBI. I'll just drop that in the backlog. Hopefully it goes to the bottom of the queue, or so. Oh, went to the top. Nice. So I'm now going to drag and drop that thing around. This is ordering of the product backlog, if you will. Now, at this point, I have not committed that this work is going to happen. Nobody has done that. No one has said that this work is going to happen, but I can order it inside that product backlog in maybe how I hope it goes out. And what this will do for me is it gives me a way to queue things up to walk into our product backlog grooming sessions. I'm going to jump over here just a moment to talk about that. hopefully in your organization, you are maintaining a product backlog that looks something like this. You understand the work of the current sprint in a very, very detailed way. That is to say, you've probably decomposed it into a task, because that's what most sprint backlogs look like. The next 2 or so sprints out, however long your sprints are, that much work has been estimated, both by the product owner and by the development team. In that way, we all know what it is that we're building. If you walk into a sprint planning meeting and are handed a product backlog item that you've never seen before, something is broken. That is not the intent. The intent is that you're going to spend some time with this process of product backlog grooming. The product owner is responsible for working with the development team in an ongoing manner to groom and make really tidy these product backlog items. And we'd like to see about 2 sprints worth out. More than that, and you're probably wasting your time and money, because whatever inventory of requirements you build, you may very well never work on. And if you're not looking at least that far out, how in the world are you doing any sort of longer-term planning, even medium-term planning? So it's a balance. And this is what we ask our product owners to do. So what does that look like? Probably it looks like this. We walk into, let's see, let's go here. We may walk into that grooming meeting. I'm going to start back up at the top here. There we go. Well, I'm just going to go to the backlog view. That works just fine. Here we are. So we're looking at our product backlog, and this is a very common way to see it in that grooming meeting. So we walk in, product owner often will say, here's a new feature, a new idea that I have. Used to, we would probably pull that up in Excel, a product owner sitting there with Excel, and you can still do that. You can still attach Excel up to this thing to product backlog management. But this UI is not bad at all. So what we could do is use this view, and we start talking about it. So this process of talking about it assumes, first of all, that we don't have an estimate yet. The goal of what we're doing here in this grooming session is basically to get that estimate out and to understand the acceptance criteria. Here's what that looks like. Product owner says, I want this thing. And developer says, okay, yeah, but what about this? Product owner says, good point. Here's my answer. When we have the answer to that, the answer is, developer says, but what color should it be? Product owner says, it should be green. That's the answer. This becomes acceptance criteria. Every time a product owner has to answer a yeah, but question from a developer, that's called acceptance criteria. Okay? And it goes here. And we get to watch it accumulate over time as we discuss this work, hopefully. Now, what a lot of people don't know about user stories is that I can use the as a I want so that structure to specify some high-level business behavior, like so. Whatever. That, to me, as a developer, is not particularly interesting. As a product owner, that's an interesting little syntax. As a developer, not so much. What's far more interesting to me is this acceptance criteria structure that we often don't use with user stories. But it goes like this. Given some context, let's just say, given I entered a valid name when I click add then the new user is inserted into the database, something like that. However we want to state it. Here's some acceptance criteria that's fundamentally different than just a set of bullet items. If this is how you start recording answers to developers' Yeah-but questions, it's going to pay off like this. The development team, sometimes your quality assurance folks too, can write a test using a unit testing framework that looks just like that. Now, I was very careful about how I said that. It's probably not going to be a unit test, and that's okay. So there we go. We've got ourselves a product backlog item, and this is what product backlog grooming looks like. It's not uncommon for teams to spend up to 10% of their time doing this, and that's a lot of time. Yes, it is. It also prevents all of the meetings that you would have if you didn't do this, and all the mistakes that you would make. It makes it so that the work is actionable when we walk into the planning meeting, the sprint planning. This is a picture of a sprint. It's important to realize that a sprint is a container for all of the other events in Scrum. Sprint planning, some people care about this. Believe me, the intricacies of detail of language and nomenclature, people really get into this. So here's the thing. The sprint is a container for all of the other events. Sprint planning meeting, daily Scrum, sprint review, sprint retrospective. We just talked about product backlog grooming. That is not an official part of Scrum. It's just a practice that most teams find useful. I suggest you try it. Because if you're walking into that sprint planning meeting and getting surprised, something's wrong. So this is how we don't get surprised in sprint planning. We do this grooming process. The real point is to keep a well-ordered and structured product backlog. So we walk into sprint planning and create that plan. Now what's interesting about that is that a little while ago I asked how many people think about that plan as a commitment. And this is what I had in mind when I asked that question. It's this thing that I'm sure many of us have seen before, called the cone of uncertainty. It was made popular by a guy named Steve McConnell. And what it asserts is that planning early in a time cycle is in effect wrong. In other words, when you get started on some creative piece of work, some software that you're creating, at the moment you get started, you know the absolute least about what it is you're going to do. And so your answer for how much this is going to cost and when it's going to be ready is the most wrong right then. And what's interesting about that is that that's exactly when we ask for budget. Right? That's just a side note, frankly. The real thing I want to highlight here is this. The cone of uncertainty is a real thing. What it says is that I'm up to 4 times wrong when you ask me how much it's going to cost on day one. As time goes by, I work on the project, I understand the code better, I understand the thing that I'm making better, and I get more accurate about the estimates I'm giving you for when it's going to be done and how much it's going to cost. Reasonable. We can intuitively see that. And if you can intuitively see it there, you need to be able to intuitively see it here. This is what the cone of uncertainty looks like in Scrum. It still exists, even in an iterative incremental model. So I ask you again, can you commit to scope? The answer is absolutely not. And often there is a demand from the powers that be, whoever they may be, in our company, a demand that the development teams commit to scope. If that demand is being made of you, it's something that you should probably discuss with your company, with your product owner, whomever. They are probably not using Scrum to its fullest extent because they're trying to plan everything in advance instead of react to reality. And that is, in fact, what Scrum is all about. I actually heard a very interesting thing the other day, and it was a TED talk that a gentleman was doing on fear. And it turns out that there are 5 things, according to this psychologist, that we're really, really afraid of. And the second one was uncertainty. We're just afraid of that biologically. It produces a flight or fight reaction in our brain to not know something when we are asked. Isn't that funny? I think that has a lot to do with the demand for certainty in what it is we're making. It's not really about budgets, it's about fear. Accordingly, we've changed in the Scrum Guide the terminology that we use to talk about what comes out of that sprint planning meeting. We now talk about a forecast, which has a little less meat to it, if you will. You think about a weather forecast, depending on where you live, you either take it seriously or you don't. Where I happen to live in Idaho, the forecast is probably good up to about 3 days. Up to 5 days, the weathermen have very little idea what they're talking about. But you know what they do? They produce a 10-day forecast every day. Why? I have no idea, because the second week of that forecast is wrong. Always. And that's pretty much what happens in a sprint. Accordingly, we changed this terminology in the Scrum Guide. You will no longer find the word commitment except for this instance. A development team in a sprint review, a Scrum team in a sprint retrospective can certainly make commitments to each other about the behaviors that we will have in the next sprint. We can commit to our behavior. We cannot commit to scope. This is what most of those plans look like coming out of there. We take some things off the top of the product backlog. We forecast those into our sprint, and then we decompose those into tasks. This is exactly how Team Foundation Server asks us to do that. So let's think about walking into that sprint planning meeting. When we walk into that sprint planning meeting, we're probably going to see the backlog. Oh, I didn't save my work item there. That's okay, we won't work on it in this sprint. Now, note the new state on these things. I suppose these could have been set to approved had we gone through and had we as a team decided we wanted to use that approved state to indicate that it was ready for a sprint. In any case, one of the things we use velocity for is to project into the future, product owners in particular, but inside of a sprint, the software or the development team will often look at its history. How have we been performing? And use that to help inform how much work they can pull. Now, that's certainly not the only thing they're going to look at. And this feature called a forecast tool, this forecast tool right here, I think can muddy this issue. So I think it's a cool tool, but before I even click it, take it with a grain of salt, okay? This is what that tool does. It shows us, based on a given velocity number, a forecast of how these estimated product backlog items might play out, given the current order of the backlog. It's pretty cool. Now, I can actually come up here and I can say, this is the thing that I'm nervous about with this tool is that product owners are going to use it all the time to do this. I really wish that white number 5 desirement would get done in the next sprint. So what I'll do is I'll just change their velocity, or convince them to bump their velocity up. I meant to go to 25, not 30. 5, there we go. So if I can incent that development team to hit a velocity of 35, whatever the heck that means, in their next sprint, then I'll get my feature that I want. We used to call these stretch goals, right? And product owners are really good at doing this. Come on, guys, I'll buy you a pizza if you can give me, deliver this one. This is the moment when we make the decision to trade quality for scope, right here. and it's the development team's responsibility not to do it. Just saying. So this tool, public and available though it may be, and kind of cool looking, I think it's pretty dangerous. That's what it's for, though. It shows us that projection. Maybe we know that we have a velocity of 18, and that's about right. So we come into these work items in the sprint planning meeting, and we can set them to the next sprint, or the sprint that we're planning. Let's say it's the sprint 1. We've already done that here. So we have, we have several product backlog items that have been committed to this sprint or forecast in the sprint. See, it's even in my head. I can't even get rid of it. It's been so long we've been using that word commitment. I'm trying. Okay, so these 4 items have been forecast into this sprint. If we go inside one of these guys, pardon me. Let me back out of that just a second. The sprint planning that we can now do, now that we have those there, is in this node. We go to the current sprint. This is the one we're planning. And now we've got this view of the sprint backlog. Okay, so I'm going to flip back and just show this again. Here we are in the product backlog. We're looking at everything. Okay? And we can see that this item has been forecast into that sprint. And there were a couple of others, actually. This one, too, even though it's really low on the order list. And what does that say? Well, that says that there is an incongruity in this data, right? There's this thing that's ordered really, really low in the product backlog, but somehow it got assigned into sprint 1, assigned. That's something we have to be careful of. It's just, it's a tools versus process thing. So people over process, process over tools, yet we have this ability to take something from the very bottom, throw it into a sprint planning meeting. It's called some feature that I want. If I look in sprint 1, there's some feature that I want. It's been approved. It's just data. Okay? It is not a rule for how you have to behave. So I just like to be a bit careful of these things. Now I'm sitting inside of my sprint planning meeting, or I'm getting ready to go to it, and here's my product backlog items that we'll be looking at. And what I can do is actually set up capacity for my team, and perhaps we're going to do, this man-hour loading type of model. Whatever. This tool is here. A lot of people feel better when they move these little widgets around, because it makes that little fear, uncertainty, and doubt thing go away for some reason, even though they know they're lying to themselves. So here's a set of tools that are really kind of slick, and they got a little jQuery, and maybe they can make you feel better and sleep at night. Whatever. I don't think that this type of load projection is based too much on reality, in my experience. So what goes on in this room? We might look at those loads. We also are going to sit for each one of these things that the development team has selected for the sprint and create a set of tasks. So remember that we are creating a plan here. And in this case, we'll say do something. This is a task, and we might put remaining work on it. Is remaining work for you on a task in hours? Most people it is. There's nothing in Scrum that says this is how you have to do this. Remember, I don't even have to have tasks. I could just have failing tests or whatever. There could be some other mechanism of tracking our plan. Most teams will estimate this in hours. Now, what was really interesting, and I hope this gentleman's not in here because I don't mean to pick on you, sir, but somebody came to the pre-con yesterday, and afterwards we talked a little bit about what's going on in his organization. He said, we estimate these tasks in hours, and then we add them up, and we see that we've got 160 hours capacity. We saw that in that capacity planning tool a moment ago. And then we back off and we only pull about 100 hours worth of work into our sprints and we still don't deliver it. I said, okay, well, what do you do the next sprint? Well, we do it again. Well, why do you do that? Because it seems like it should work. Well, do you always have work that remains undone at the end of the sprint? Yeah, I do. And if if we don't pull at least 100 hours, even though it says 160, we look to our management like we're just lazy. You can call those hours, but they're not. Call them acorns or donkeys. I don't care what the unit of measure is that you're using, but it's not time. That team is estimating, and they think they're estimating in time. They're not. This is a far deeper subject, and if that kind of thing is interesting to you, I would encourage you to stay in this room after this talk, because there are two guys that are going to come in here and talk a lot about agile estimation practices. And before they even get in here, I agree with them. So what I could do is I could promise you, with the gift of my firstborn son, that there's 4 hours remaining on this task. No problem. And we might add a few more tasks. And we're probably going to load it with work, or remaining time. They call it remaining work, and it's fine. To me, a product backlog item is a request for software to do something different than what it does, and a task is a request for a human being to do something. That makes sense to me. So that becomes our plan. And there we have it. So we can look over here and load up according to what the tool tells us. This is exactly the situation that I was describing, that this gentleman in the pre-con yesterday was going through. So what he's saying is, we've planned that we've got 96 hours worth of capacity, but we're only able to pull, say, 44. So what happens? Well, we still don't get it done. Does that mean you're sorry and no good? No. It means these remaining work estimates that you're using aren't actually hours, that's all. Try something different than that. Okay, so we're good to go. We can take all of these things and one by one go ahead and set them into a committed state. I wish, and wishing doesn't get you much in life, that state were called forecast. It's not. So what we could do is turn these things into committed. It's actually going to take a couple of steps on a new one. So you're going to have to figure out, how do you want to use these workflow states? I don't know. It's definitely up to you. There are reporting implications of these workflow states. So if you go look at the RSS reports, then some of the reporting metrics that you'll see in there, or some of the metrics that are going to be reported in there, are going to key off of these states. So keep that in mind as you make your decision about how to do this. Okay, so now we get back into developing some software, thank goodness. So we've come out of, it's Monday afternoon, we've come out of the sprint planning meeting, we've got our plan, we work for the rest of the day, we come in the next morning, first daily scrum of the sprint. It's Tuesday morning, and we might be sitting around looking at this board. This is a new board that's inside Team Foundation Server. If you haven't seen this yet, you're going to see a lot of it this week, I'll bet you. They're pretty proud of this one. It's pretty good, too. I will tell you at Scrum.org are actually using this, and I will also tell you that we're not all software developers in that company. In fact, there are people using this tool that are in marketing that have no technology background whatsoever. But we are using Scrum to manage our operations at Scrum.org. And this tool is working just fine. The people in the organization are actually using this to bring our new website online. So we get to do things like, this sort of update. And watch this, I can take this do something A, which clearly has 8 hours remaining of work, take it all the way to done. And look what it did to that time remaining. If we open that do something A, it shows as done. Nice. Okay, so this board is not too bad. We can filter it, and if you have, we can filter it by person. If you have remote teams in your organization, if you're working with teams or people that are on the other side of the planet, you've got to have something like this. That's the bottom line, because index cards and tape are cool, but they don't scale. Period. And we get that. So this is not a bad alternative. There was an alternative for 2010, if you're still going to be on that for a while, called Urban Turtle. Urban Turtle is a product that you can add on to Team Foundation Server. And 2010 worked really well. It looks a lot like this. It gives you a visualization of what you would do with sticky tape and notepad or notes, you know. It's so funny, too, because ever since we've been doing that for about 15 years, developers think they should write an app instead. So we've all written this app a couple of times, right? But here is Microsoft's version. It's not bad. Now, during the process of the sprint, something interesting is going on here. I want to collapse up a few things just to be able to show a potential state. If I have, how many people are on my team? Let's say there are 3 people on this team. We'll make it easy. I'm going to drag a couple of things into progress here like so. Now, the reason for this happens to be that we need to go to 0 remaining work for that error. There we go. Okay, so I've got 3 people on my team. Now look at this. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tasks in progress. Is this something that happens for you? I'll bet it is. I rarely run into a team where this is not the case. And what's fun about it is that I can tell you that it's going to be one of about 3 situations. Here's one situation. We all walk out of the sprint planning meeting, and that hero guy that wants to work until 3 in the morning so that everybody thinks he's really cool and can save the company, that guy, will grab a bunch of work items and just pull them into in progress and write his name on them and say, this is what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks. Leave me alone. You guys stink, and I'm going to my office. That's one thing. The other thing that was awesome. You actually accused him of that right here, didn't you? That was great. So the next thing that could be is it could be that we have some things that are in progress, but they're getting blocked for some reason. Maybe I need a middleware server from the IT department, right? And if that's the case, then that thing is sitting there and I can't get it done. I've raised an impediment to the Scrum Master and it's still not getting done, so I'm just going to pull something else. Well, here's what's funny about the tool. Just wanted to highlight this. There's this metadata item right here called blocked. This blocked metadata item on the task. This is great because what it's going to do is it's going to visually highlight this, right? So that I click yes and everything. It's going to turn bright red so everybody knows it. Oh, no, it doesn't. In fact, I don't know that thing does anything. So if you want, I suppose what you could do is put a team alert onto tasks. So if a task goes in, that piece of metadata flips on a task, you can create an alert that emails everybody on the team. That's probably not a bad idea. The board doesn't respond to that yet. I would imagine this is a no-brainer feature that we'll see in the future. And now that we know Microsoft's going to be releasing to the TFS Azure instance far more often. I mean, they do. They're released very frequently out there. I would expect to see that piece of metadata matter here. Now, really, though, you see this in Kanban tools all the time. And that is when something's blocked, you want to see the tool itself show you badness. Now, here's another thing, though, that's interesting. Remember we said we might raise an impediment to our Scrum Master. Okay, great. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a work item in Team Foundation Server, right? Because that is the most effective form of communication you could possibly have. Not so much, in my opinion. Here's the thing. I get that some teams will find use of these impediments, particularly if you've got something that comes up that lasts for several days and you need to, I don't know, make other people aware of it. You could do something like set up, again, another team alert so that when an impediment is created, maybe when an impediment is cleared, it goes out to the entire org or something like that. I've actually done that, and that worked pretty well. If we went into Team Foundation Server in our company, this was not at Scrum Org, we went into Team Foundation Server and created an impediment work item type, it would email that thing to our Chief Technology Officer, to me, to the IT Director, to everybody in this chain who's responsible for getting rid of that thing. And so, you know, my phone goes off in a restaurant because an impediment comes up, as it should. That's my job, is to serve the people underneath me who are trying to deliver software. So that's my little pitch about the work item type for impediments. I get it. Probably better is a conversation. If you're going to use it as a communication vehicle for the real-time communication, just notification for people. But if what you think is useful is to document everything that goes wrong, you should be a tester anyway. And that you probably are. Okay, so let's see. We've gone through a lot of the features here. One of the things that I want to ask you guys, though, is about getting to done. Definition of done. There is this notion of done work and undone work. An increment needs to be done. An increment is that bit of software that's coming out of our sprint, out of our Scrum team at the end of each sprint. So we show that increment at our sprint review meeting. Is it done? Is a very common question. And there's this, this is a very real story. We helped an organization start to use Scrum. It was a medium-sized company, 300 people or so, so everybody knew each other in this company, not a huge monolith. The Chief Technology Officer was very happy because we went to the first sprint review and the team says, this is what we got done, and she saw that and said, oh, that's really nice, yeah, I like that. And so we went another sprint and walked into the sprint review meeting. This is what got done this time. Oh, that looks really good. I like that a lot. And it happened again on the third one. Third sprint. That's really good progress. You know what? You guys have done so well, and this is so good that we can ship it. Remember that curve that we saw in the very beginning of this presentation that says we're going to increase or rapidly deliver business value? This is how we do it, by being able to ship earlier than we thought we would. Great, she said, let's ship it. And they said, we didn't think you meant done like that exactly. She said, well, what kind of done did you think I meant? And they said, the development team, well, we thought you meant the kind of done where we could put it on the screen and show it and the UI responded. That's what we thought you meant. You mean this is actually not even going all the way through the stack and talking to the data tier? Nope. This happened. It took 6 more weeks to take that work that the teams had reported as done and actually make it done. Done means that we could ship it if we want to. The way to get there is to have some kind of a shared definition amongst the team members. So let's try this. What is the first piece of feedback that you get from Visual Studio as you're typing a line of code and Visual Studio will say to you, you're wrong? What is it? Sounds like rain. Sorry? Could be build. Any other ideas? Red lines. Somebody said red lines. That's a trademarked term of IntelliSense, sir. It's got a little TM next to it because Microsoft asserts we don't have that in Eclipse. So IntelliSense is that tool. And yeah, that's the first piece of feedback I get. I'm typing something, it's a, some new variable name, or I make a mistake. IntelliSense turns red. It's like spell check for code. Then what's the next thing? I would say that you were right on this next one. The next thing is I'm going to compile and link this stuff. Control-Shift-B, right? What's the next piece of feedback that I might get from my tooling? Hopefully it looks like that. We've got some kind of test that developers are writing. Maybe they're called unit tests, and those things pass. Remember, I'm still on my desktop. I'm still developing locally. These things all have to be true, or certainly I'm not going to check in, right? Now, if at least I got these things to pass, I just might go ahead and check in. And when I check in, if I happen to be using Team Foundation Server, I might apply a lot more constraint of quality to this check-in, to this code that I'm putting in, because I can have something called a check-in policy, which is a little program that runs on my computer before and does stuff by checking my code before it allows me to check in. Alternatively, in the new tooling, we can actually we can request a code review that creates a work item for our check-in. So I want to check this in, but as part of doing so, I'm going to create a request for code review. I'm going to ask a couple of people to look at it. I assign them to that thing. If I pass that review, then we'll go ahead and put that code into the repository. So there are tons of things that we do before we actually get into the source control repo to try and control and improve quality, and that makes absolute sense. But we keep going beyond that, and we get to continuous integration, where we're going to do all of those things again, but probably on a different machine, right? And now we might be running other tools, and maybe you did this in your check-in, where you've got code analysis or static analysis that's like a pairing buddy, right? You've got code metrics where we can measure our cyclomatic complexity, et cetera, et cetera. And then we might move this to an integration environment. And then we might push it up to yet another environment where another team is going to take it and do performance testing. And then we're going to show it perhaps to some potential customers. And they are going to give us feedback on it through user acceptance testing, and maybe then we put it into production. Here's the point of this, is that at some point along the way here, there is a definition of done that your team is using. It could be that you're going all the way to production. That's what it could be. That's what it is in continuous delivery environments. You can't get to that, though, without a significant investment in automation. Flickr, the website Flickr, is one good example of continuous deployment. If you go to code.flickr.com, you will see at the bottom the last time Flickr released into production. And it will have the little gravatar picture of the developers that made the change. Talk about transparency. That's pretty cool. The longest I've ever seen in between releases was 2 days. Think about that for a minute. That is changing the world of software development. I understand it takes 48 hours from the time that the developer last makes a change in code on his laptop for Gmail to get it into production. 48 hours. That is a tremendously large system. And they're able to do this. If you can't do this now, you'll need to be able to do it in the future. This is where we're going. This is continuous delivery. And you must expand your team's definition of done in order to get there from here. We know this. The cost of making errors is greater as we get toward the outside of this envelope, right? That doesn't have to be as true if we have automated the heck out of everything so that we've achieved this continuous delivery model. If we push something out, it doesn't quite work, we change it and push it again. The more frequently we do this, the better we get at doing it, because we're practicing. We practice releasing, we get good at releasing. And that's a lot about what Agile is about. Release frequently, early, and often. I really like your sinks here in the Netherlands, and I'm not kidding. I like the bathrooms. Because every bathroom I've been in, the sink sits on the counter, not in it. It's just the weirdest thing. We don't have that. So I'm going to hire a plumber when I get home, and I'm going to ask him to put one of these sinks in for me. And my question for you is, given all of these criteria that plumber will have for knowing that he's done, what would you say the definition of done is for this plumber and his assistant? That's our little development team here. So if we look at the manufacturer's instructions, I'm going to buy my sink, it's going to come in and it'll have some instructions inside. It's sort of like if you buy the Telerik control suite and you read the manual. Do I have to use it that way? I would propose not. There is, however, my instruction to him as a client. My instruction to him as a client is, I want it to look and function this way. Is that part of the definition of done? Probably not. That's actually part of the acceptance criteria, because every time he asked me questions like that, I would answer him, and he'd say, yeah, but what about? And then we'd record it as acceptance criteria in TFS, because my plumber uses that to manage his work. He also has to contend with the code, what we call the code or law in the trades in the United States, so that if he were to do something or he were to implement this sink in a certain way that violates that code, he would be in trouble, right? And finally, we've got his own personal craftsmanship, and that comes down to maybe he's got a couple of brass pipes that he's fitting together and he has to weld them, and he wants that weld to be just so. And some plumbers won't care, and some will spend an hour of their own time making that weld look perfect so that they can feel good when they go home at night, and developers do this. And some don't, and I want to hire the ones that do, because it's much easier to stop them than to make the others do it. So I would assert to you that the definition of done is a combination for our development teams of the code or law and personal craftsmanship. And unfortunately, we as an industry, we don't have a code or a law. It doesn't exist. It is your responsibility as a member of a development team to come up with your with your definition of done. And somewhere along the way, it should have these things in it, plus a lot more, I would assume, like refactoring and all sorts of things that we would see in our design, low coupling, etc. So I would ask that you take this into account, go home and expand your definition of done. That's exactly what we should be doing in our sprint retrospectives. There is an article available on MSDN today. There's the bit.ly for it that myself and Ken wrote on this topic specifically, being done and undone. It's an MSDN article, and there are a few more that will come out with the release of Visual Studio 2012. And I thank you very much for your time, you guys.